The street smelled of hot tar and coffee. Morning light carved the edges of the city, glancing off chrome and glass, but it didn't soften the lines of a man who had spent years at the edges of things. He sat on a battered milk crate, a guitar strap across his shoulder, fingers tracing an old sunburst top like a map he knew by heart. People passed without looking, half a step away from stories they would never hear. A red car idled at the curb, its polished hood reflecting the faces of the city. A crowd had gathered, enough to make the street feel like a stage. Voices rose, curious and cruel, a low current waiting for a spark. A well-dressed young man stepped out of the car, shoes too new for the sidewalk, a keyring heavy in his hand. He wore arrogance like a scent, and it reached others fast. A laugh came, sharp as a coin. "Play us something, street singer," someone called, and the laughter folded into a dare. The young man flicked his keys, a small thunder, and leaned in close, eyes bright with the kind of scavenging amusement that comes easy when you're used to being right. He mocked the guitar like it was a relic. Like this man was a relic, too. The old musician didn't flinch. He closed his eyes and drew a breath, letting the city settle around him like an audience. His hands moved slow at first, finding a rhythm the crowd could ignore if they chose, but the first chord caught like a bell. It was simple, honest, the kind of sound that doesn't ask permission. A boy in the crowd stopped chewing gum. A woman shifted the grocery bag in her arms. Even the pigeons seemed to hush. The chord folded into the next, and a melody drew out of the guitar as if the instrument had been waiting its whole life to speak. It wasn't flash. It wasn't a show. It was truth with a pulse. The young man laughed, louder now, and tossed a challenge. "If you play something good, I'll give you my car," he said, voice carrying like a scoreboard. The crowd whooped. Someone started a chant. The bet settled into the space like a gauntlet dropped at the feet of the old man's crate. He opened his eyes and smiled, not at the car, not at the money, but at the idea of telling something true. The first notes of the song were a slow call, a hook that crawled up from the ribs and wrapped around the listeners. The story in his playing moved like a river, memory, regret, a child's laugh under a porch, the ache of being overlooked. It built slowly and then took wing. The young man, expecting a novelty, felt the crowd shift. A few laughed uncertainly, uncomfortable with something that reached deeper than their jokes. The melody bent into a solo so clean it pricked the skin. The old man's fingers flew with a confidence the crowd hadn't credited him with. Every note landed like a line in a letter from someone who had loved and lost and kept going. As the song went on, people's faces softened. The jeers smoothed into silence, then into attention. Some closed their eyes. Someone in the back whispered a name like a prayer. The melody held the city's noise at bay, a temporary hush that breathed with the old man's rhythm. The young man watched, jaw tightening. He stepped closer, keys still in hand. The bet was out there. Pride was louder than sense. The car's red finish flashed with each passing cloud, a mock crown. He wanted the spectacle, the power of making someone perform, of being seen as clever and generous in the same breath. The old man launched into a bridge that climbed and fell, a phrase that felt like an apology and a dare. It made you remember things you had decided to forget. When he finished the passage, the silence wasn't awkward. It was a kind of respect. Even the wind waited. The young man cleared his throat. He had been certain the old man would stumble, that his offer would land him applause, that the crowd would owe him a laugh. Instead, the applause began slow and then rushed, honest and surprised. Faces lit with an unplanned warmth. People counted their own small sorrows and found for a moment that someone else had given them a soundtrack. Something in the young man's chest shifted. Pride is porous. Wind finds its way through. He smelled fear there, not his, but the fear of being small in the presence of something larger. He had come to the corner to prove a point and found himself exposed. He swallowed and added another layer to the bet. The way men sometimes pile hurt on top of hurt to feel steadier. "If you can make it through the whole song, I'll give you my car right now," he said. The key was heavy in his hand like a promise he didn't intend to keep. The old man nodded. He didn't ask about the car's value or the motives behind it. He only played. The refrain returned, now braver, threaded with a tenderness that made cheeks dampen. The crowd moved with it, a single living thing swayed by a melody that had no regard for their schedules or assumptions. When the last chord rang and lingered, no one rushed to break the spell. The applause that rose was not cruel. It was a real recognition. The young man, cheeks flushed, handed over the keys with fingers that trembled. His laugh was gone, in its place a narrow smile that didn't reach his eyes. People nearby reached out, some to steady the old man, some to touch the car as if to mark the strange moment. A woman cried openly. A child hugged her mother's leg. A businessman, hands still ink-stained from an early meeting, tipped his hat without thinking. The city seemed altered by the sound of the guitar. The old man looked at the keys and at the young man. "You sure?" he asked softly. He wasn't greedy, his eyes had depth like maps. The young man nodded. A small crowd drew close to witness the transfer as if it were a rite. The man stood slowly and took the keys. He set them on his palm and felt the metal catch the light. He didn't know cars. The names of models floated like ghost words in his mind. He felt awash in something that wasn't money. Something like incredulity, like grace. Like the recognition he'd been missing. A young woman from the crowd, who'd recorded the whole thing on her phone, pushed through to ask a question. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked. The old man smiled, and his smile was a landscape of small victories. "Every corner," he said, "every city, every people. I learned to hear what's left unsaid." His voice was soft but steady. The young man watched him, a complicated look in his eyes. He had expected triumph, not a lesson. Maybe that's why his laughter had died. Laughter feels foolish in the presence of truth. He had wanted to be the one to hold power, but power had been redistributed in a moment, and he didn't like the weight of less. The old man climbed into the car slowly, tasting the leather and the hum of a world that had been kept just out of reach. The car's first engine note sounded like a new language. The crowd cheered and then parted as the vehicle eased away, its red tail a small flame against the city. Word spread fast. People uploaded videos and the clip traveled beyond the block, beyond the city. For some, it was a lesson about assumptions. For others, it was a strange morality tale. Rich youth humbled by art, a homeless man given a car. But the story people told missed what had actually happened under the sun. A transfer of dignity, a recognition that had nothing to do with status. Days later, the old man returned to the same corner with his guitar. The car was parked a few blocks over, keys surrendered to a neighbor in case they were needed. A surprising courtesy performed like a secret. He sat where he always sat, and the city began to recognize a new chapter in its afternoon script. The young man watched from a distance, quieter than before. He'd been changed by something he couldn't define, maybe a crack in his armor, maybe the discovery that charity can look different from how it was imagined. Sometimes he walked by and didn't say a word. Other times he lingered at the edge of the crowd, listening like a student who had missed some lessons and was eager to make up for them. People still came to hear the old man play. Tourists took photos, locals returned with sandwiches and cups of coffee. But the songs were the same kind of honest things, and the price of listening was never a laugh. The man played for time and memory in the ragged beauty of the everyday. Months passed and the corner story found new details. The averted eyes and mocking smiles that had once folded the man into the pavement now often gave way to nods and conversations. A small music teacher from a neighborhood school offered free lessons to anyone who wanted them. A mechanic gave the man a keyless entry fob because the old set had been worn. A barista tracked down a vintage amp and left it on the stoop like a present. The old man kept playing. He used the car sometimes to visit a park where the acoustics turned the trees into choirs, or to get to a doctor's appointment without the long walk. He never became wealthy. The car did not erase the years, but it changed some choices, made certain routes less punishing, and gave him a story that wasn't just about being passed by. One afternoon, the young man approached without the swagger. He held a small paper bag and a look that had humility braided through it. He offered the man a cup of coffee and a sandwich, and then he sat on the curb and listened. They spoke about small things at first, about how the city smelled different in rain, about chords and mistakes and the way songs can come when you least expect them. In time, the young man confessed that the bet had been meaner than he'd intended, and that he'd been terrified of seeing himself as small. The old man shrugged and said he had seen worse wagers and kinder ones, and that sometimes people need the shape of a dare to find a new edge. They both laughed, and the laugh was simple and real. The car became less a trophy and more an instrument. The old man learned to check the oil. He learned the names of buttons and the gentle etiquette of parking in a world that had once felt off limits. The young man learned to sit with patience, to listen more, to trade a laugh for a question instead of a taunt. Months became a year. The corner's myth faded into a quieter lore, carried by those who had been there, and those who remembered the clip online. The city's pulse continued, relentless and forgiving. For some, the story was a fleeting amusement. For others, it was a turning point. Once, as the sun sank and the streetlights blinked awake, the old man played a tune that the young man recognized as a lullaby his grandmother had hummed. It was a small, private thing that felt enormous. The young man closed his eyes and let the memory pour in. He had once thought power was owned by those who could buy, but power sometimes comes as a responsibility you didn't ask for and don't know how to carry. On an ordinary evening, the old man's guitar case sat open with a handful of coins and a note someone had left that read, simply, "Thank you." The man smiled and put another coin in. The neighborhood felt tilled by the music, fertile in a way no one could have foreseen. Years later, people still told the story differently. Some said the young man had been cruel, others said he'd been redeemed. Some said the old man took the car and disappeared. The truth was simpler, stranger, and quieter. A man who had been ignored for years was seen for a piece of himself he had always carried, and that seeing changed other people's ways of looking. The city moved on, as cities do. But in a corner warmed by afternoon sun, a guitar kept preserving the kind of grace that can only come when someone is willing to play. He had a past, of course. Nobody really arrives at that corner without a luggage of stories. When he was young, he had played in smoky rooms where the lights dimmed to a hush and strangers bought quiet tickets just to hear him spill his truth. He had known applause that felt like sunlight and nights of hunger that felt like winter. He had learned to tuck those extremes into his hands along with the strings, to make shelter of melody. The guitar had been with him through hospital corridors and subway trains and Sunday mornings when the radio told stories he could never forget. Sometimes he thought about the rooms he'd left behind. He remembered a woman with a laugh like bells who once let him sleep on her couch for a week and taught him how to tune the world by kindness. He remembered a child selling newspapers who taught him the specific rhythm of busy hands. Those memories were not always tender. Some stung like bruises. But they all found a place inside the songs he played. On one rain-soaked evening, a man who had once been a club owner stopped by. He recognized the line of the old man's style and nodded with the kind of familiarity that meant they'd shared a time and a place. "You play like the old records," he said, voice small. The old man shrugged, and the club owner left him a paper with the name of a studio, a number hardly used. The old man kept the paper in a pocket, as one might keep a talisman, not out of hope, but out of respect for what had been. He never called. He had learned to live on the kindness of small economies. A woman named Rosa brought him soup when the winter bit deep. An elderly tailor pressed shirts across from the corner, left him fabric scraps for guitar straps. A teenager taught him how to upload a clip to a social site and muttered that people liked stories of unlikely luck. The old man smiled at the teenager and said nothing about luck. He called it patience and honest work. The young man's life had its own architecture. He grew up in a house where sharp words were exchanged between briefcases and casseroles, where approval was measured in transfers and the clink of keys. He'd learned that status was a language worth speaking. He'd learned to protect his edges with jokes and to perform generosity. Like an act on a stage, underneath there had been a small ache, an unacknowledged hunger for a thing that couldn't be bought. He had not always been cruel. Once he had sat through a concert and wept at the way the saxophone bent like a question. He had secreted away a battered harmonica in a drawer and tried to teach himself a few breath notes. He had abandoned it when his father mocked him for softness. The memory of that harmonica felt like a small key behind his ribs, a key he now kept pressing into holes made by other people's expectations. The day he handed over his keys, news vans were still not a fixture, but local reporters stopped by to ask quick questions. The old man demurred. It is one thing to have your life changed and another to let it be repackaged and sent off with headlines. He preferred the unadorned life, the kind that didn't require an interview. In the weeks after, offers arrived. A music student asked to record his voice. A small cafe offered a weekly slot paid in tips and a warm sandwich. A community center asked if he would lead a workshop for kids who couldn't afford lessons. He agreed to some and politely declined others. His life was not a commodity, and he carried his dignity like a detail of clothing, subtle but present. He taught kids to find a simple rhythm and then to tell a story inside it. He said the words play from what you have as often as he tuned. Children leaned into the sessions with intense concentration, their small fingers fumbling at first and then catching the rhythm like catching a train. One shy boy, who had been bullied for wearing hand-me-down sneakers, learned a 3-note trick so clean it made his bully laugh instead of jeer. The boy's shoulders dropped 10 degrees, as if someone had taken a weight from them. Sometimes strangers asked the old man whether he regretted the life that led him to the corner. He would look at them with steady eyes and shake his head. "Regret," he said once, "is a room you can visit but you shouldn't live in. You can take what you must from it and leave the rest." Music was the vehicle by which he carried his choices forward. In music, there is repair. The young man, in private, started to notice small changes in himself. He stopped roaring jokes across the table in corporate lunches and listened for the pause that followed someone else's sentence. He began, without making a grand announcement, to volunteer a small amount of his time to a mentoring program for local kids. He found there was a humility in showing up, in being quiet and present. The world did not applaud him for these little shifts, but his mirror did. A winter brought an unexpected challenge. The old man's hands ached with the cold, and his guitar needed a new set of strings. Word of his needs spread, and a local music shop surprised him with a care package: strings, picks, and a wool strap. The owner told him he could pay what he could. The old man left a folded bill and a song for the owner's daughter, who loved to hear him play in the shop window. The exchange felt like a small rebalancing of favors that had been owed for years. There were critics, too. Some felt the spectacle had been staged. Others whispered that the young man had only given away an old car as a publicity stunt. The old man heard these murmurs and didn't bother denying them. He had no interest in defending the sincerity of others. What he treasured was quieter, moments when someone stopped mocking another human being and allowed themselves to be surprised. On a humid spring night, a power outage struck the block. The city flared with the occasional distant siren, and the corner was swallowed by a dark calm. Someone lit a candle and placed it on the crate the old man used as a seat. He sang by that little flame, his voice a thread that stitched shadows together. Neighbors brought candles and cups, and for the duration of the outage, the block was its own small country. No news feeds, no outside judgments, just people making light together. Years later, a plaque was proposed by a neighborhood council to commemorate the moment the car was given. The old man politely declined. He said the memory lived better without brass. He preferred that the corner remain a simple place where people could find music without an admission price. He liked the way that the story lived in people's mouths and not on metal. Sometimes, late at night when the city hummed softer, the young man drove past the corner with the windows down. He would listen for a fragment of a song that punctured the dark, and he would remember the way the guitar's wood caught the sun. He'd feel a small warmth, and then exhale. The bet had been foolish in the beginning, but its consequences were not simple. It pushed him, and it pulled others towards small acts that added up. When the old man finally stopped playing publicly for a string of days, concern rippled through the neighborhood. The mechanic who had lent him the fob tracked the car and found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. "I went to see an old friend." The community breathed a collective sigh. He had not disappeared. He had simply stepped into another chapter and was carrying his guitar with him as always. The city keeps many such stories, moments when someone is seen and something else changes. The corner's tale was one of them, and it traveled in the soft human way stories do, through visits, through shared sandwiches, through a song hummed by a passerby. It wasn't dramatic in the headlines, but it was steady in the lives it touched. Music kept the city awake,